Hey, Polly, we're here for part two today.
Oh, of Griefology?
Griefology. Yes. So we have our guest commentator, Gloria Christ,
Yeah,
and we're also being joined by Jackie Cutillo.
nice. I hope Gloria is in the same I was gonna say studio, but room that she was in last time. It's fascinating. We could do a whole podcast on what's behind Gloria.
Yeah, we could, but we need all that joy when we're talking about something like grief and trauma.
We
So
do. Does Dr. Jackie have a specialty?
she's going to be talking about a lot about grief, youth, family.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's going to be great. It's going to be very informative, and I'm sure she's going to share a lot with us.
All right.
All right. So without further ado,
Welcome back, everybody. This is our second episode of Griefology, which is really coming to the understanding, the language, the concept of grief. So I am really, really honored to introduce our second guest, who we have worked with on a couple of different panels where arts and health and arts and education and arts and well-being have been at the intersection of making sure that each and every child and adolescent is getting the services they need. And a lot of that intersects with grief and loss and trauma and addiction. And so it's really powerful that the four of us are able to sit down because we're in the same pie. And these are all these really interesting pieces of the pie that have to do with the same thing, which is really to serve those in need, and through various platforms. So Jackie Cutillo is the director of specialized operations for the New England offices of Youth Villages, which is a national nonprofit child welfare organization. She has been there for, I guess it's 17 years now, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And she is responsible for ensuring clinical interventions and trainings and the fidelity of what all of those mean in support departments. She's responsible for the clinical internship department, the emergency support department, and the licensed program experts department. She also maintains a small caseload at a local mental health counseling practice and specializes in working with children and adolescents and their families. She has a PhD from North Central University, an MA from the Michigan School of Professional Psychology, and is a licensed mental health care counselor. Her background includes navigating issues related to diversity in the mental health care system of care, collaborative problem solving, and managing crisis situations with families in need. She also is the recipient of the Mary Lou Sutter's Excellence in Human Services Award that serves the Commonwealth. And I believe Youth Village is also coming into Rhode Island, if it has not yet.
Yes.
So we're serving lots of areas here. Welcome. I am so thankful and honored to be here with you and have so many people share in your knowledge and wisdom and grace.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really excited to be here.
Yes. So talk to us about grief and the caregiver and everything that entails.
So the concept of grief is something that unfortunately is not completely foreign to me from a personal level as well as professional level. So in my master's work, I went to the Michigan School of Professional Psychology, as you mentioned, Gloria, and my senior thesis was a heuristic study on the impact of living with a loved one that has a terminal illness as an adolescent. So I've had that personal experience through adolescence, and then in my work at youth villages, as well as my private practice work, unfortunately, a lot of the youth and young people have some sort of grief in their background. When we're thinking about grief, that could be someone, a caregiver, someone close to them, their favorite aunt, uncle, cousin, grandparent. It could be someone that is just their favorite person in life, and something terrible happens and that person's no longer there for them in whatever capacity. I think grief feels like, to most people, like when someone passes away. And there can be a lot of facets of grief. It's not just the death of someone. It could be someone, goes to jail or becomes an incapacitated caregiver, or is just cut out of that relationship. And so it's possible to mourn the loss of an individual and mourn the loss of that relationship without that person actually passing away. And sometimes that makes it more complex because they're actually still there. They're just unreachable.
Yeah, we actually talked about that in our first episode. And what's remarkable is exactly what you just said, is so many people attach grief with death. And that is not always the case. And I think also, we talk about grief, certainly in New York, when I was living in New York and the AIDS epidemic was everywhere. That was insurmountable grief, where a relationship went to a caregiver, with so many couples experiencing this horrific loss. And then I believe we're still seeing grief from COVID pandemic and the incredible amounts of loss, where suddenly relationships shifted, family dynamics shifted because that favorite person or that sole provider was gone. So in that capacity of talking about grief and unresolved grief and not dealing with the concept of grief, talk to us a little bit about what happens and what can happen as a co-occurring issue, which can lead to a trauma diagnosis with unresolved grief, and how that impacts children, families, and adolescents.
Yeah, by definition, trauma is different for everyone. Like, that is the point of trauma. So you and I may experience the exact same thing on the surface, but because of protective factors, resiliency factors, support, mental health concerns, all of those things, each individual experience can or cannot result in trauma, and the level of that can be different among people. So when you're thinking about grief, it's really, really challenging to look at someone and say, oh, you must be feeling X because you've had this experience and it impacted you, and Y. You don't know that. You don't know that as a clinician. You don't know that as a best friend. You don't know that as a caregiver if you have a youth dealing with grief or trauma. I think it's really important to understand what that person needs, and not necessarily from like how can I make you feel better, right? Like, working through grief and complex trauma and complex events isn't always about making someone feel quote unquote better. They're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and see rainbows because someone said you did a great job managing that grief. Healing through grief and healing through trauma is a really long and arduous process and experience, and it's not often linear. It's very like cyclical. You may feel really good one day, and then you're driving down the road and a song that reminds you of someone that you're missing, or a blue car reminds you of some event that you had, and it can bring all of those feelings right back up. So I really think it's important to think about looking at grief and looking at trauma as very intertwined aspects of the same coin. And it presents in so many ways. It can present as features of depression. It can present as features of anxiety. It can look like turning into behavioral concerns, which is sometimes what I see and work with kids and young people, is that they're manifesting their emotions in a physical response because they don't have the language or the capabilities to say actually what is bothering them and what might be the support for them.
So that's really interesting to me, because working from a somatic foundation, the body doesn't lie. When you're working with children and adolescents, and that grief has not been expressed,
Yeah.
it begins to settle. You can see it in the way that a child walks, or the way that they carry themselves, or even their cognitive ability to read and comprehend or create. In that behavioral aspect, because a relationship has changed, and I want to bring Polly and Greg into this, because so much of the prevention and the strategic prevention, especially with totally preventable, the relationship, especially with someone who is dealing with addiction, if it's a parent, the child has always had that relationship with their parent or caregiver with the presence of addiction.
Mhm.
And, you know, a child always knows who their mother, their father, their primary caregiver is, even with the layers of addiction. When an overdose has happened, when addiction causes that individual, that primary, to be taken away, a child not only has the grief of that loss, but not even knowing what resentment feels like or anger feels like. So is there, and Polly and Greg, how much of this do you see in the adult world with individuals, even young adults, who can't rely on their primary caregiver anymore because addiction has been involved? So not only are they angry and not understanding why addiction came first instead of the care and well-being of them. So let's just talk about that for a minute, because it is so layered and because it is so complicated and complex. So Greg and Polly, can you talk about what you see in the work that you all do as an organization that deals with prevention across the board? And I'm even talking, you know, housing, or housing insecure, or food insecure. All of those things add to the level of grief, right, and loss. So I'm going to open up the floor to the three of you to sort of talk about that, because it is so prevalent right now. And certainly what we're seeing in the country with loss just happening on the daily, you know, and we don't even know the ramifications of that right now. So let's just talk about that small little subject and see where it goes and what the reality of that situation is.
I think here, what we seem to notice, or what I seem to notice, is when it comes to that grief and loss, it's really associated with our grand family and kinship family work.
Mhm.
So it's like you were speaking about, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that the parent is no longer, or the caregiver is no longer around. I mean, excuse me, that the caregiver is no longer alive, but they could be incarcerated. It could be an addiction issue. It could be a number of things, but the grief still shows there. But I did have a question I'd like to ask you, Jackie. Can you discuss the unique grief associated with loss of a caregiver? Because it really does tie in with our grand family work that we do.
Yeah. It's such important work that you all do with Grand Family. I know that we have a number of youth and young people in our programs that are in a kinship placement or in a grand placement. And that really brings an additional layer. So thinking about the loss of a primary caregiver is a lot of those things that Gloria was talking about. Like, you know, you as a child or a young person have expected or been told that this person is going to provide for you for, you know, the duration of your childhood, adolescence, into adulthood. And then you're feeling feelings of, why me? Or why did this happen? Or perhaps, what could I have done to prevent this from happening? And taking on a lot of that responsibility, a lot of that parentification that might be going through your brain. One of the things that I've learned in professional, personal, all of the realms is always can't understand the why, right? Like sometimes things just happen. And thinking about how to support kids, young people, families, individuals as a whole, oftentimes you can spend time on the why and spend time on the how and trying to understand that. But that's not going to be the most proximal driver to healing. The healing portion is going to be what do you need to be successful, not the understanding of the why. So the moving forward, the really integrating the loss, whatever capacity that looks like, into what that means for you. I think a lot of the individuals that I work with would say that there is anger towards their caregiver, whether that individual is no longer present due to an addiction issue or abuse and neglect concern or something along those lines, or whether it's due to an illness or long-term situation. I think there is resentment, even thinking about our families who have experienced loss because of COVID. Perhaps that person wasn't following CDC recommendations or put themselves in unknown risks. I hear kids thinking about like, well, if they would have just done X, Y, or Z, perhaps that person would still be here to support me. And I think that can be really hard to rationalize. And one of the reasons that I shy away from like having people like really try to understand the why, because you oftentimes can't. You just have to be in the moment and think about what it's affecting now and how to be able to not forget, because 1,000% not forget, but how to integrate your memories into who you are today to be able to move forward.
Ooh, I love that. Integrating memories into who you are today and how to move forward. That is not talked about. And for some individuals, especially children and adolescents, grief becomes the known unknown. They know the word and they know they're supposed to be sad when something happens, but they don't understand that the unknown it's layered and it is cyclical and it's not linear. So when that caregiver relationship changes, that's an unknown. They're dealing with the unknown feelings and where it sits in their body and how they're supposed to learn and how they're supposed to move forward. Because talking about these things isn't necessarily first on the list. And so then it becomes that cycle of it's known, but it's unknown. So we're not going to talk about the unknown. We're just going to let you go through all of these things in a haphazard way. And which, I think we said last week, it was over, what is it? I love this. And I've thought about it's unwavering. Grief is unwavering. And let's see, it was just what we talked about, how grief sort of settles in. Grief is an all-abiding factor of life. Mourning is how we express it. So in the role of caregiver, and especially in, because Polly and Greg, you guys do a lot of work with grandship and how that takes over and how a grandparent who was in one role suddenly becomes the primary role. So do we see grief with the grandparent who is suddenly exchanging a part of their life to now care for their grandchild because their own child couldn't, step up to it? I mean, it's so layered, and we don't talk about these things that impact the trickle down or the residue. So, Jackie, in that role, you said parentification, and that also is prevalent in a lot of what we're seeing, especially with middle school and high school students who had to step up and become a parent. Sometimes taking on a 40-hour work schedule and trying to get their high school diploma. or
And caring for siblings
caring for
or
siblings. So let's talk a little bit about the long-term effects of those roles, becoming a parent at 14, or having your grandparents step in and become your parent, and how that it can't sit well with an individual who suddenly the grandparent was one role and now they're another role. So let's talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear what Greg and Polly and Totally Preventable have to say to that, as well as when caregivers, when primary caregivers maybe come in and out, because that's an additional focus of grief and trauma and loss. Is my caregiver was here for one day, gone for the next, maybe out of the home or out of the picture for a couple of years or something along those lines, and then they come back. And are almost expected to be reintegrated into the system that they left, but that's not always possible because of these changing dynamics in caregivers. So grandparents or kin have had to adjust their day-to-day responsibilities. I think a lot about our grandparents who have had to learn how to use Snapchat to have like good monitoring systems in place. It seems funny, but like those are things, or like navigate, somebody's school accounts. Like a lot of schools have 5 or 6 different apps to be able to, check what's for lunch, see what how the kid's being dismissed from school, and like sign up for after school activities. And so learning about that, and what I see there then happen is that an older sibling will step in and take on some of those roles. Oh, just let me handle it. I'll monitor social media. I'll work on the school stuff. I'll make sure they're home by 9 and did their homework because I'm doing it as well. And so I can support with that. But it brings a lot of responsibility onto an older sibling to be able to care for that, their younger siblings. It also mixes up, like kind of mashes the feelings of grief and the feelings of responsibility. And you can share feelings of responsibility for navigating and supporting yourself through that grief, but sharing responsibility for the care of someone else is a really big, heavy weight that when you're thinking about all of the things that go into raising a child, it really does take a village. And if you're that sole provider in that village because your caregiver, your primary caregiver, is unavailable, think about all the things that you have to figure out as an adult and ask a 14-year-old to do that. We see long-term effects. We see, adults who are in this situation not be able to manage conflict effectively. We see them not being able to regulate their emotions. We see simple tasks like changing laundry or going grocery shopping as things that they were never taught how to do. And so there's long-term generational effects of parentification.
Can you maybe talk about a little more about how grief affects youth differently than it affects adults? Because as adults, if we are trying to help a child through grief, we maybe use our own mindset, our own coping skills, which with all good intent, but I'm assuming young people handle grief differently than as old folks.
Yes, and right, everyone's entitled to their feelings, right? And so you may share feelings more with someone and less with another. But I think a big part of this is, by and large, our adults are more able to communicate what they're experiencing in a way that is societally acceptable, right? So I see from kids that don't have that language to describe what they're feeling inside, what their body feels like, and how they're really processing what they're going through, manifest that in a behavioral way, like I mentioned. So, for example, I read a referral for a youth last week that his mother had passed away. And the referral came through saying that he has suicidal ideation. He would like to die to be with his mother. In my brain, that's not suicidal ideation. That's a misplaced